We spent a couple weeks getting acquainted with the sermon and what it's all about and help to prepare ourselves to read it and understand it in the way that I think Christ would have us. And we're going to get into the meat of the sermon now, and today's going to serve as kind of an introduction to the first section of the Sermon on the Mount, which is commonly called the Beatitudes. And so, again, if you would turn over to Matthew chapter 5. I'm going to read verses 1 through 11. It says, "Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them." And then we get into the section called the Beatitudes. And he says this, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So over the next few weeks, we're going to break down this section of the sermon here, the introduction that Jesus has to his sermon, what we call the Beatitudes. And you see this formula repeated over and over again through these verses where blessed are, and he introduces some quality that he's highlighting, and then for they, and he describes the blessing that comes along with that quality. If you think about Beatitudes, where did we even get that word from to begin with, the Beatitudes? It's not found in the text there, so where did it come from? Well, the Latin Vulgate, the Latin translation of the New Testament that Jerome put together in the 4th century A.D., in that translation, the Latin word that's used for the word that's translated here in our English translation, blessed, is the word that we get Beatitudes from, and so that's where that title comes from. But what are they? We got to talk for a minute about the word blessed or blessed. Almost all of our major popular English translations use that word in the Beatitudes. Blessed are. But people have spent a long time arguing over whether that's the best way to translate that word or not. And if you survey commentaries that are out there and what scholars say about how to best translate this word, you get a lot of different suggestions. A lot of them come back to the fact that, well, actually, blessed is probably the best way to translate this, but some have some points of contention with that word blessed because they argue that blessed has some serious connotations associated with it. And when we think of the word blessed, their concern is that we might start to think about what Jesus is saying here in terms of some kind of transaction that we engage in with God, kind of like the way that a child might get an allowance from a parent. So if you do these things this week, check them off on your allowance board, and then you get $5, $10, I don't know, with inflation, whatever an allowance is today. But the idea is I give you something, you give me something in return. And so the concern some people have is that blessing kind of carries that connotation, that if I behave a certain way, God will give me something in return. And that's not necessarily what this is all about. Some people have suggested that perhaps a better way to translate this is with the word happy, because what Jesus is really trying to describe here is human happiness. But others, and I think rightly so, point out, well, there's kind of shortcomings in that term happiness too, because it's such a loaded term for us today, isn't it? But there is some value in it, because how many people today live in pursuit of happiness? We're chasing after that fleeting feeling of happiness. And so something about that is embedded, I think, in Jesus' words here. Jonathan T. Pennington wrote a recent book, a commentary on the Sermon on the Mount, and the thrust of his argument in that book is that a better way to translate this is actually with the word flourishing. In fact, the title of his book is The Sermon on the Mount and Human Flourishing. The idea is that Jesus is describing those qualities that we possess that lead to true human flourishing. God wants us to flourish on this earth, right? Go back again to the garden. He created everything, and what did he say when it was made? It is good. And he invites us into that goodness. He wants us to take advantage of the goodness that he created just for us to enjoy alongside him in his presence. My favorite suggestion comes from R.T. France in a very popular commentary that he wrote on the book of Matthew. He surveys all the different words that we could use to translate this, and he suggests the Australian term, good on ya. But then he also admits that that doesn't do a lot of good for anybody who's not Australian. But the idea is that it's kind of describing a way of living. This idea that your life is just filled with goodness. And so a lot of people rightly point out that that's what this is really all about, is the good life. And you think about the radically different ways that people today describe what a good life would be. In fact, if I just asked you to close your eyes for a moment and just picture the good life, what would you be picturing? Engaging in your favorite hobby, or maybe just a week off of work, or your favorite vacation destination. You know, what does the good life really look like? But that's really at the heart of what these blessings are all about. I think probably the best way to help us understand this is through Psalms. The first Psalm specifically, and I want to ask you to turn over there, to turn to the first Psalm, Psalm 1. We're going to read this together. The very first word of the first Psalm is the word blessed. Blessed is the one. The significance here is that the word that is used in Matthew, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it's the same word that's used here in Psalms. And I think we get a good indication of what this word is all about by reading through the Psalm. Listen to what it says. Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. But not so the wicked. They are like the shaft that the wind blows away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction. So I want to encourage us as we read through the Beatitudes and that we think of the word blessed every time that actually this is the image we have embedded in our mind. The image in the first Psalm. That the person who delights in the law of the Lord, the person who meditates on his law day and night, what is that describing? What kind of person? A person whose whole desire in life is to align themselves with the will and the way of the one who created them. What will life look like for a person like that, whose main desire in life is to understand the will of the one who made him? What will that look like? It will look like a person who is a tree planted by a stream of water who will never stop producing fruit. The leaves don't ever turn and fade and fall off. There's no seasons in this person's life. There's just a continuous blessing that comes from the fact that they decided to plant themselves next to the source of everything good and true in life. That's what a blessing looks like. So it's not, God, I'll give you this and you give me this in return. It's, God, I'm going to plant myself here at the source of you. And in return, my life will be blessed. I think that's the idea that Jesus is trying to get across in these blessings that come in the Beatitude. Now, I want to go back to what we talked about last week. And if you weren't here last week, we spent a long time talking about all the connections that we see in Matthew's gospel between Jesus and Moses, and how Jesus is portrayed as the fulfillment of that promise God made to Moses, that one day a prophet like him would come to his people, and we had to listen to him. And how Jesus is the new Moses, the mediator of a new and better covenant. We talked about all that, but there's a few things we didn't have time to talk about, and I want to highlight those for you this morning. Let's start in Hebrews chapter 1, if you turn over there with me. Hebrews chapter 1. In the book of Hebrews, the Hebrew author draws a lot of comparisons between Christ and various elements of the covenant that came before him. And the word that the Hebrew author likes to use a lot is the word better. Jesus is our high priest, but he's a better high priest. Jesus is the mediator of a covenant, but it's a better covenant, and so on and so forth. And in Hebrews chapter 1, this is the profound way that the Hebrew author actually introduces Jesus to us. He says, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son. What he's getting at is there's something has changed. There's a difference in the way that God spoke through the prophets and the way that He now speaks to us through His Son. What's the difference? He says, well, that Son He appointed as heir of all things, and through whom He also made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory. I want you to lock that phrase in your mind for a few minutes this morning. The radiance of God's glory. Through Jesus, God's glory is put on full display. And we'll talk more about God's glory in just a second. And the exact representation of His being. If you want to see God, look at Christ. And through Christ, you see God. Sustaining all things by His powerful word, and after He had provided purification for sins, He sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. Now that's how He introduces Jesus to us. These are the first words of His letter. But later on in chapter 3, He's going to draw a comparison between Jesus and Moses. And that idea of Jesus as Son is what's important here. So look at Hebrews chapter 3. He says, therefore, holy brothers and sisters, who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, whom we acknowledge as our apostle and high priest. He was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in all God's house. So again, this comparison between Jesus and Moses, but he's going to show us here what the difference is between Jesus and Moses. He goes on and he says, Jesus has been found worthy of greater honor than Moses. For just as the builder of a house has greater honor than the house itself, for every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything. And so here's the main point. Moses was faithful as a servant in God's house, bearing witness to what would be spoken by God in the future, but Christ is faithful as the Son over God's house. That's a big difference, isn't it? Moses as a servant in God's house, Christ as the Son ruling over God's house. And so the point is that there's a difference between Jesus and Moses, isn't there? And that should flavor and color the way that we read the Sermon on the Mount, because Jesus didn't come to just do what Moses did all over again. And He's not just giving us the law all over again. He'll talk about His fulfillment of the law later on in the sermon, and we'll do a deep dive when we get there. But the point is that when we hear Jesus preaching in the sermon, He's doing something different than Moses and better than Moses. This isn't just a commentary on the law. This is something wholly different. And we see that at the end of the sermon when the people are hearing Him teach and they recognize this is not just another rabbi. This guy's doing something different. He's teaching as one having what? Authority. And what's one of the phrases that we find Jesus saying over and over again in the sermon? You've heard that it was said, but now I say. Only the Son can speak that way. And so we need to have that in mind as we approach the sermon. Now, this is relevant to John's gospel, and this ties in with the idea of glory and Jesus manifesting God's glory to us. So in John's gospel, and remember when we spent a long time in John's gospel a couple years ago? Okay, how does that gospel start off? He introduces Jesus to us. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then you skip down to verse 14, and he says, and the Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us, literally tabernacled among us. We have seen, listen, we have seen His glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now follow me here for a moment. Do you guys recall, way back when I started 3.5 years ago, first series we did was a series through Exodus chapters 32 through 34. I don't know how many of you remember that. But we talked about what happens in those 3 chapters, where Moses is called up to the mountain to receive the covenant, the law, and while he's up there, what is happening with Aaron and all the people below? They get frustrated because Moses took too long, and so they get all their gold together, and they do what? They make a golden calf, and they begin to worship that image. So when Moses returns from the mountain, having received the commandments that represent the covenant between God and His people, he finds them worshiping a golden calf, and he gets mad and he smashes the tablets. You guys remember this story? Okay? And then what unfolds is a deep dive into the character of God himself and who God is, a God that would be patient and gracious even with a generation like that. And what follows is a conversation Moses has with God where Moses says to God, look, I need to know that you are going to be with us. Because if you're not with us, we're no different than any other people in the planet. We're not going to make it through the wilderness if you're not there with us. And God promises him he will be with her. And then Moses presses even harder and he says, I want to see your glory. The idea that I want to understand fully who you are. Would you reveal yourself fully to me? And you remember God's response? He said, well, you can't see my face, because no one can see my face and live, but I'll hide you in the cleft of this rock, and I'll pass by, and after I pass by, you can look at me as I walk away into the distance. So you can come face to face with part of my glory, but not all of it, because you can't handle it, right? There's this idea that we just can't handle God in all his glory. We can't see him face to face because it would destroy us. But now, with all that in mind, listen to what John says. He says, out of his fullness, we have received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. Moses only got to see part of God's glory. Jesus is the full manifestation of God's glory. We see God through the Son in a way that we could never see God through Moses. And if you recall, when Moses came down from the mountain, what happened? The people were terrified of him because his face was shining, because he had come in contact with the glory of God, and it freaked the people out, and he had to wear a veil over his face because of it. Now, I've got some homework for you. For those of you who like to continue to study throughout the week, look at 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and see what Paul does with that story. And I encourage you to spend some time in there. He says, and we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. We get to approach God now through Jesus with unveiled face. We get to see his glory fully manifested to us because of the Son who shows that glory to us. Now, what does that have to do with the way that we read the sermon? Again, Jesus is not just doing what Moses did before. Something else is happening here. He is revealing God to us in a way that we could not have understood before. A way that only the Son can reveal to us. And I encourage you to keep that in mind. Now, let's talk for a minute about his audience here in Matthew. That shouldn't be Hebrews chapter 3, that's the wrong reference. In Matthew chapter 5, as he begins the Sermon on the Mount, it says, now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down, and his disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. There's two specific groups of people that are mentioned in the Sermon on the Mount. Number one is the crowds. You look back at the end of chapter 4, and Jesus' public ministry is starting to grow in popularity, and specifically, people are amazed at the fact that he is healing people. And so the crowds keep coming because they're bringing to him all of these people that were sick in hopes that he might heal them as well. And so the crowds are interested in Jesus as a healer, as a miracle worker. And so they're coming to see what he's going to do next. But there's another group of people present here. Not the crowds, but who? The disciples. Now what's interesting in Matthew's account here, up until this point, we've only been introduced to 4 of the disciples. Back in chapter 4, Jesus calls the first 4 disciples, and it's 2 sets of brothers that were fishermen by trade. Peter and Andrew, and James and John. They're the only 4 that are named so far. So you've got this handful of disciples and the crowds. And the difference is the crowds are here to see what Jesus is going to do. The disciples have been called by name to follow him and have already dedicated themselves to that purpose. And so when Jesus goes up on the mountain, who is his immediate audience? He went up on a mountainside and sat down, and his disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. So Jesus' initial audience is the disciples who have already made that commitment to follow him, but you've got this large crowd of people that are there as well. And if you look at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 7, it says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowd were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. And so the crowds were there, and they were kind of eavesdropping, as it were, on what Jesus was teaching, but his teaching was directed specifically at those who were committed to following him. Not just those that were interested in what he might do, but those who were committed to following him. Now, what does that have to do with us today? And I want you to think about us as the audience of the Sermon on the Mount. Here we are 2,000 years later, still wrestling with this sermon. In John chapter 16, Jesus is trying to prepare the disciples for his imminent death and what that's going to look like for them. And he's using all these kind of turns of phrases as he's trying to help them come to terms with this. And finally, he just comes and plainly says to them what's going to happen. And as a response to that, it says, Jesus' disciples said, "Now you are speaking clearly and without figure of speech. Now we can see that you know all things and that you do not even need to have anyone ask you questions. This makes us believe that you came from God." And Jesus' response is, "Do you now believe?" I mean, this is the end of his ministry, and they're still struggling to understand the weight and the depth and the breadth of all these things Jesus is saying. And we see that consistently throughout the Gospels, right? As Jesus' disciples are hearing him teach, they're constantly struggling to understand what he's saying. He speaks in parables, and they pull him aside and they say, "Hey, you got to help us understand this." But the idea here is that when Jesus is teaching the disciples, there's a back and forth. There's a give and take. They're asking him questions because they need to help in fully understanding what it is that he's saying. And the reason I bring that up is because of this. When I first introduced the Sermon on the Mount a couple weeks ago, I read through it in its entirety. You remember, it only took 12 minutes to read through. I don't want you to get the impression that Jesus got up on the mountain, spoke for 12 minutes, and everybody got up and went home and were like, "Oh, that made perfect sense." Do you think people wrestled with this? Do you think maybe there was some back and forth and the apostles interjecting and saying, whoa, hold on, what does that mean exactly? Or could you clarify this or help us come to terms with this? I don't know exactly how it happened, but I'm certain that Peter wasn't there and jumped up and said, "I got it, let's go." I know he was asking questions, if not out loud, then at least in his head. And I want to say that because here we are 2,000 years later, still wrestling with the weight of these words. These are not difficult statements that he makes, but the weight of them and the power behind them and the complexity of thought behind them. This idea of blessed are those who, because. There's so much to think about here and to truly wrestle with. And I hope that you are asking a million questions as we go throughout this text, because I'm convinced that's exactly what Jesus wants us to do. To ask questions, because that's how we grow in our understanding of what it is that he's teaching us. And so for us today, you may be here as a disciple already, committed to following Jesus. Or you may be here as a spectator, curious in this Jesus you've heard about, but not yet convinced in who he is. Either way, this sermon has something for you. And I hope you will be patient with yourself as we wrestle through the truths that Jesus shares with us here. I hope you're willing to dig deep and to spend some time in this text on your own as we go throughout this. All right, one last thing I want to share with you this morning. And that's a text that provides, I think, a very important background to the Beatitudes. And it's one that I want to encourage you to spend some time in as we prepare to unravel the mystery of this text together. In Luke's Gospel in chapter 4, as Jesus goes to his hometown and preaches there and kind of reintroduces himself. Right? These are the people who know him best. They watch him grow up. But he's introducing himself not as Jesus the carpenter's son, but Jesus the anointed one. And he gets in the synagogue and he chooses a text in order to introduce his ministry and his mission to the people that knew him best. And so in Luke chapter 4, starting in verse 16, it says, "He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him, and unrolling it, he found the place where it is written." And Jesus begins to read from Isaiah chapter 61. Isaiah chapter 61. Would you turn over there, please? Isaiah chapter 61. It begins like this. The Spirit of the sovereign Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. All right, I want to take a minute, and I want to ask you to do something. And I want to ask you to do this with at least one other person, or if you've got a group of people around you or your family, however you want to do this, but you need at least two people, okay? One of you have Isaiah 61 open in your Bible, and the other have the Beatitudes open. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to read through Isaiah 61, and I want you to compare it to the Beatitudes, and I want you to ask, are there any places where these two scriptures cross over? Are any of the themes in Isaiah 61 repeated in the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5? Make sense? Okay, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to do that. So spend some time right now having that conversation with at least one other person around you. Isaiah 61 and the Beatitudes. All right, we'll wrap it up. The murmuring's coming to a stop. I'm impressed by your ability to whisper. Well done. All right, raise your hand if you saw at least one point of crossover there. How about 2, 3, okay, or more? All right. Now, I'm not saying that everything is a direct parallel here, but I am saying Isaiah provides a very important foundation for the gospel writers as they're trying to see who Jesus is. And especially in Matthew's gospel, Matthew references the prophet Isaiah over and over and over again. And I think Jesus is doing here something very similar to what he was doing in Luke's gospel account when he introduced himself to his hometown as the Anointed One. And that's what this is all about. How does that passage start in Isaiah? It says, the Spirit of the sovereign Lord is on me because the Lord has, what? Anointed me. That's where we get the term Messiah from. That's where Christ comes from, the idea of the Anointed One of God. This is what God is calling his Messiah, his Anointed One, to do and to be. And Jesus is taking ownership of that. And I think what's happening in the Sermon on the Mount is that this, among other places, provides a backdrop for what Jesus is trying to communicate to us in this sermon. And I want to leave you with this thought this morning. The Beatitudes aren't just another list of rules or commands. Let me pause and let that sink in for just a moment. Read the Beatitudes again. Listen to how they're worded. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are, blessed are. It's not go and do or you shall be. There's no imperative here in the Beatitudes. None. So it's not just another list of rules or commands. What I think this is a proclamation, and a bold one, that the promised Messiah has come. His kingdom has come with him. We're going to talk about kingdom next week. His kingdom has come with him, and the blessed, the good, the happy, the flourishing life that we were designed for can be found in his kingdom. And so I see in this an invitation more than anything. An invitation into the good life that we were designed to take hold of from the very beginning, but it can only be found in the good news that's brought to us by the Anointed One. And so for next week, let's look at this first beatitude. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. What does it mean to be poor in spirit? And what in the world is the kingdom of heaven? Let's talk about that together next week. How can we serve you this morning? If there's anything you are in need of, in any way that we can encourage you, study with you, pray over you, whatever it is, if you have a need and you'd like us to know about that now, invite you while we stand and we sing this song, come forward and let me know about it. Let us know how we might serve you. Let's stand and sing together. Who else could make every king bow down?